All right, so our first author that I want to look at is one that I am sure that you are all familiar with, and I'm sure that a vast majority of you have either read or heard of Jonathan Swift in some capacity, either through reading probably one of the most widely taught work, A Modest Proposal, which we have for today. And I chose it because I think even if you've already read it, it really kind of encapsulates a different type of satire through prose. But anyways, or you're familiar with him with Gulliver's Travels, which he also wrote. But anyways, Jonathan Swift is probably considered one of the, if not the greatest wit of the 18th century. He wanted to cure society's ills with humor. Um, and he was born in Ireland in 1666 to English parents, and he died in Ireland in 1745. And he spent most of his life in Ireland, devoted to Irish affairs, but always considered himself English and a Tory. And I think that that distinction between not considering himself Irish is certainly even though he was born there and he lived there a majority of his life, he still considered himself English, which is interesting in and of itself. And I want to talk about that when we talk about the background and the context of A Modest Proposal. So anyways, Jonathan Swift, like I said, was born in Dublin of an English family which had important connections but little wealth. But through the generosity of an uncle, he was educated at Kilkenny Grammar School and then Trinity College in Dublin. And between 1689 and 1699, he worked as a private secretary to a distant kinship, Sir William Temple, a retired diplomat. And there he also received a first rate education in politics through his contact with Sir William Temple and many other well known politicians. And through this kind of experience, he learned much about the vice, hypocrisy, intrigues, deception, and corruption in the political world. And as from a literary position in his works, he is one of the greatest masteries of English prose, not poetry. He was a master satirist, and even today, he's still regarded as a national hero in Ireland. Some of his more famous works are The Tale of the Tub, The Battle of Books, and Gulliver's Travels, what some consider to be his greatest satirical work. Um, he was a man of great moral integrity and social charm. He had a deep hatred for all of the rich oppressors and a deep sympathy for all of the poor and oppressed, and specifically for the Irish people against the oppressive English. His understanding of human nature was profound. In his opinion, human nature is seriously and permanently flawed. To better human life, enlightenment is needed, but to redress it is very hard. He intended not to condemn, but to reform and improve man's nature and human institutions. And there is often an under or overtone of helplessness and indignation in his work. His satire is usually masked by an outward gravity and an apparent earnestness, which renders his satire all the more powerful. And the piece of satire that I have chosen for us to examine, because it's one of his shorter works, is A Modest Proposal. And I think it's important to look at the entire title of A Modest Proposal. The entire title, the title in its entirety, is A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People in Ireland from being a burden on their parents or country, and for making them beneficial to the public. So that is a mouthful, but in it, it really embodies everything that he is is emphasizing in A Modest Proposal. So we have in this this kind of idea of children, of poverty, country, and more specifically Ireland. And in order to really understand what's going on in this pamphlet, is this kind of historical context of what's going on in Ireland at the time. But before I begin with that, the genre of A Modest Proposal is a pamphlet, which was a small book used to circulate arguments or commentary on social issues. And his purpose in this pamphlet is to capture the audience, highlight indifference, and force them to recognize possible solutions. But the context of this, like I said, the context of The Modest Proposal is certainly something that you guys need to understand if you are going to really get the point of this satire. And in a very gross, abridged version, Ireland, it's kind of an Irish problem, or the problem of the Irish, which would be something that the British would call. And Ireland had been under British rule since 1171, and a majority of the people in Ireland are Catholic. And we know that you guys have known this kind of political and religious turmoil that's been going on in England over Catholic and Protestantism and all of that kind of thing. But Catholics were largely shunned in England. And England and a minority in Irish are largely Protestant. And England controlled, because it's a colony, English controls the Irish Parliament and passes laws limiting the rights of the Catholics. And this kind of these trade policies really, and I hate using this word, but it is an applicable word, crippled Irish economy. Over the centuries, England gradually gained a foothold in Ireland, and we know that in 1541, Dublin recognized Henry VIII, a Protestant king, as the King of Ireland as well as the King of England. But in spite of repeated uprisings by Irish Catholics, English Protestants acquired more and more estates in Ireland. And by 1703, they owned all but 10% of the land. Meanwhile, legislation was enacted that severely limited the rights of Irish to hold government office, purchase real estate, get an education, and advance themselves in other ways. And as a result, many Irish fled to foreign lands, including America. And most of those who remained in Ireland lived in poverty, facing disease, starvation, and prejudice. So essentially, England is a real jerk or the English are a real jerk to the Irish. And most of the people, most Irishmen worked on farms owned by Englishmen who charged high rents, so high that the Irish were frequently unable to pay them. And that's a term called absentee landlordism, and which Swift talks about in A Modest Proposal. And consequently, many Irish farming families continually lived on the edge of starvation. And it's in this Ireland, an Ireland of the tyrannized and the downtrodden, that Jonathan Swift attempts to focus his attention on in A Modest Proposal. And Swift lived in an Ireland which was a colony politically, militarily, and economically dependent on England. It was manifestly in England's interest to keep things as they were, because a weak Ireland could not threaten England, and the measures which kept it weak were profitable for the English. And if you remember back into when we talked about our Commonwealth, Oliver Cromwell does an extreme, that genocide campaign through Ireland where he plummets an already poor Ireland into more poverty. And this desperately poor country was overpopulated, full, full, as Swift said, of beggars, racked periodically by famine, heavily taxed, and with no say at all in its own affairs. England controlled, like I said, the Irish legislature. English absentee landlordism, or English absentee landlords owned most of the land which was worth owning, and Irish manufacturers were deliberately crippled so that they could not compete with those in England. And Swift was really enraged at the passivity of the Irish people, who had become so habituated to the situation that they seemed incapable of making any effort to change it. The Irish Parliament ignored numerous proposals which Swift made in earnest, proposals to tax absentee landlords, to encourage Irish industries, to improve the land, agricultural techniques, and quality of manufactured goods, which would have begun to rectify things. So essentially, Swift wrote extensively on ways of changing the situation for the Irish, but it falls on deaf ears. So a modest proposal is at once a disgusted, as David Cody says, a disgusted parody of Swift's own serious proposals, as well as those of less disinterested projectors, and a savage indictment both of the exploitive English and of the exploited Irish. A modest proposal is a manifestation of Swift's sense of anger and frustration, and as such is merely the most savage, the most brutal, the most heavily ironic of the numerous tracts which he produced during the early 18th century in an attempt to shame England and to shock Ireland out of its lethargic state. So we have here a bunch of stuff that's going on with the English and Irish, and those, sorry. And those are that's kind of the backdrop for him writing. Some themes that he focuses on in A Modest Proposal include Irish complacency and inaction, past politics, prejudice against the Irish, and the exploitation of the Irish, or greed. So these are the things that we are going to be looking at with A Modest Proposal. And I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pick up with Alexander Pope, our other poet for the week, and The Rape of the Lock.